I will now bring on stage Odinaka Akpamgbo, who will be speaking on how to make a winning PhD application. So this is the first speaker who will be speaking on DPhil or PhD application. So I'll just run quickly through Odinaka's profile. Odinaka is a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. His DPhil project is funded by the Faculty of Law scholarship. Prior to commencing his DPhil, Odinaka completed the BCL at the Faculty of Law with distinction. Odinaka's BCL was fully funded by the MasterCard Foundation AFO Scholarship and the Faculty of Law Regent Park Scholarship. Before Oxford, Odinaka obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree at Enugu State University of Science and Technology with first-class honors and as the salutatorian, winning multiple course prizes. Odinaka also graduated with a BL from the Nigerian Law School with a first class and with 2 prizes, including the Prince Ajibola KB San Prize in Civil Law. He's published several articles and contributed in journals. So guys, please give a warm welcome to Odinaka. Odinaka, if you're there, you have the floor, and I will present your slides shortly. Odinaka, you...
Can you see me?
I can hear you, and now I can see you, yes. Yes, just I'm bringing up your slides in a jiffy. Okay, yeah, let me know if you can see your slides now. Yeah?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Sage. Good afternoon, everyone. Of course, Sage has already mentioned, my name is Odinaka, and I am a DPhil candidate in public international law at Oxford. The DPhil is Oxford's fancy name for a PhD, so it's the same thing for a PhD. It's the same thing as a PhD. I want to thank you for being here and thanks, Sage, for inviting me. In fact, when I was applying, I wish someone had given me a primer like this when I was preparing to make my own applications. And of course, much of what I'll be discussing has already been done justice to by Bukola and Faye. So I will attempt to prune the presentation so it fits clearly within 10 or 15 minutes, which is going to be quite perilous work because you will appreciate it's going to be a lot of compression, given that a standard PhD application takes months and indeed potentially 15 years of work into 50 years of work to prepare. And that is what I'll be compressing into 15 minutes. My presentation will cover 3 subjects, which are preparing to apply, your application and your interview, and your funding competition. So the first one is the application preparation. Next slide, please. So the first question you have to ask is whether you really want to do a PhD. And this question should be quite intuitive and honestly, perhaps redundant, because it is self-serving to ask yourself whether you actually want to do a PhD and go through the trial and the turmoil of a doctorate. Do you really want to get a PhD because you want a doctor in front of your name so that you can compete with medical doctors, or because maybe your family or your friends want you to do one, or because, next slide, please. Yes. My supervisor likes to tell a story that I want to show them a picture on the next slide, the third slide after this one. that, yeah, this is a stethoscope for medical doctors. So my supervisor likes to tell a story that when an emergency happens on a flight and they ask, oh, is there any doctor aboard this flight? She usually says yes before they ask her, before she then confirms that it's an academic doctor, not a medical doctor. And if we seriously consider it, I like to also argue that even the word doctor comes etymologically from the Latin doctore, which means to teach. And that means that I think if we argued it logically, academic doctors might have in a better place to answer that name than medical doctors, but that is a terrible argument. So I'll proceed. The previous slide, please. Sorry for the back and forth. So you have to stop and ask yourself, why are you doing this? Because a PhD is quite onerous work, which is spread out sometimes 3 to 4 years. It depends on the jurisdiction. And it doesn't have to be a generic reason for which you have to do the doctorate. And the reason I say this is many times the assessors themselves can see through the pretense in your application. They can see through the hypocrisy, and they can see whether you really will have something important to contribute to your field. Bukola and Faye already spoke about this, but for good measure, you have to ask yourself whether you put yourself in the shoes of a potential supervisor or the potential institution, and ask yourself whether they might be proud to say they are your supervisor and you're researching this topic. That is a very important question you have to ask yourself before you proceed. Of course, deciding whether you wish to pursue a PhD, I think it necessarily includes deciding whether you possess what completing the PhD requires in terms of ability and qualifications. Sage mentioned this briefly when he started. Most PhDs require excellent grades, and by that I mean a first class or an upper second, especially at the bigger universities. So this is something you have to start preparing years in advance, not 1 year before your application, or even a few months before your application. And the second thing you have to consider is the topic you wish to research. At the time you're making this decision, your PhD idea is just a hypothesis, really. It is at an embryonic stage. You don't exactly know. I mean, the assessors will appreciate that you do not exactly know what the final product is going to be like, but at least you have an idea, you have a skeleton, and this is what you're going to include. I can predict Kia might speak more on this when talking about the proposal, but this is what you're going to include in the proposal. You're going to include timelines, going to explain the PhD proposal with as much clarity as possible that someone can possibly see into the future what it's going to look like when you complete it. Then, in deciding the topic you wish to research, I think next, can I see the next 2 slides, please? I sort of devised, yes, can you go back on the slide before this one? I devised something you might want to see as a formula for the perfect research topic, which is having a PPP model. Essentially, the first P should cover the problem, the research question itself. And this is targeted, this specific advice is targeted at lawyers. If you really want to get funding for your PhD, and this is something I wish I had known myself, your topic has to be, if you really want to get, some of the most attractive funding awards like Clarendon or Rhodes or some other things, your topic has to be understandable and fascinating, not just to you, but to people that are outside of your field. And I know that lawyers can be quite narcissistic. We have a majority of lawyers on this call, to presume that everyone knows about, syndicated lending agreements or competition law or some of the other jargon we use in our daily work, but just simply assume that someone who is a physicist is reading your work, and you have to explain it clearly to them. And that is the problem you have to solve under the first P, which is the problem. This, of course, this goes without saying that um, the problem has to be one that even fascinates you, so you can wake up and complete it. The second one is the person. You must have the capability or the capacity necessarily to complete this project. Because you're the conduit for completing the project. So you have to have the capacity for completing the project. And this is what you have to satisfy the assessors of through prior research experience. It can be work that you've already done in your undergrad or research assistantship. But you have to satisfy this criterion also specifically. And the last one is simply the process. How are you going to complete this project? Some people might see this more as a methodology question, but I prefer to see it as funding, because funding is what decides whether you can, essentially primarily decide whether you can complete the project yourself and complete it within time. And it starts from the realization that funding competition is with people researching, fascinating topics such as AI, data and computing, or perhaps music, physics, some other fascinating research topics, even vaccines or solving the issue of HIV or cancer in the world. It puts them ahead of the race in the funding competition. And as a lawyer, you're competing with these people. And that is why I stated earlier, you have to avoid the temptation to research something too esoteric or insulated within your field, something that only other lawyers in your field might appreciate or understand. Bukola and Faye already did justice to that. You have to answer the question why the funders for this project might be willing to award you nearly $500,000 in scholarship to come to research the topic you want to research. And indeed, most of the courses, I want to add this, that people considered useless in Nigeria, actually, in reality, they have an edge in this part of the world in terms of securing funding. I have found that people that studied, topics like courses like animal husbandry or food science or beekeeping in Nigerian universities, and sometimes you might see the jokes on Twitter, but they are more successful at securing scholarships for postgraduate study and for doctorate degrees than lawyers, for instance. And the third part I'd like to talk about, and this is part of the ending of the first part, is to find your supervisor. I think I can predict Kia will cover this, so I do not anticipate I will spend so much time on it. But however, supervisorship is the single most crucial aspect of your PhD. It's in fact, if you could, ability I've always wished I had was the ability to lift the curtain and to see what happens with the assessment panel and how they make their decisions. And sometimes you can see this if you make a data subject access request from the university. However, when you get the document, it might surprise you to see that often the single most important determination for whether you can really be admitted and get funding is the availability of supervision and the comments of your potential supervisor on your application. It puts you ahead of the curve. It puts you even ahead of the competition. The faculty can nominate you for university-wide funding. And that is why I wish to emphasize that supervision is the most important aspect of your PhD. And it is a very cumbersome process that you have to commence looking for a supervisor very early, sometimes 1 year into your research work. You have to stalk them, send them cold emails on LinkedIn. If you are currently doing a master's in the university, then you're in a perfect position, like I was, to get a supervisor, because these academics are just around you, and you can accost them. Okay, 5 more minutes. Sage has just prompted me, so I'm just going to shorten the application, shorten the presentation. And I think the midsection I'd like to talk about, which is very important also, is your CV is the application itself. You're making the application. I think it's on the fourth slide. Your CV for a PhD is not the same as your CV for a job, meaning that it's not the same as a professional CV, meaning that it has to be shorter and more succinct, highlighting in the main your academic achievements. That is the priority. I can use myself as an example, but before I started the PhD, I had just a little over 1 year's working experience in a Nigerian law firm. But I also like to think that I had quite solid academic accomplishments. So that is what I put at the fore to speak for me at the point I was making my PhD application. Really, although your work experience is important, what the assessors want to know is that you have the sheer academic stamina, especially in Oxbridge universities, to complete the research project. And this is what you can prove using your CV and your research experience. In this part, you can also talk about your personal statements. I have a picture on this slide that I'd like to emphasize, because when completing our LLB, we wrote a final year dissertation called a project. I think it's something. Can you show the picture on the next slide? Yes, this picture. This picture is quite I think it's quite famous in mainstream circles in Nigeria, because it's something I understand sort of in retrospect. It's a quite funny thing, but I don't think some societies appreciate the worth of research. But research is what builds the world. It's researchers that are building SpaceX and very, very important things that are making life comfortable for you. So if you have researched a question in your undergraduate degree, this is your opportunity to really explain what the question is and how that research experience added to your capacity to complete this doctorate you now wish to complete. And if I might fit it within what Bukola and Faye already explained, if you can quite graphically explain the research you did in your undergraduate degree, you can then draw a straight line from when you completed your LLB to even perhaps when you completed your LLM, and how that still fits within the same straight line for your PhD. It's really important that you do this, and you don't imagine that your LLB dissertation is one of the dissertations here that have been wasted or cast out to waste. The final thing I'd like to talk about is funding, since I have about 1 minute or 2 minutes, which is the final thing. It's the Nigerians might say it is the cocoa, but this is, as I've said this before, funding really it's the game changer for PhD applications. And I consider this might be a disservice for considering this last. But if your family is not rich in pounds, dollars, not naira certainly, and you are not from one of the oligarch families in an African country, which sincerely, if you were, you might not really be interested in a PhD, except you are a famous African DJ that I will not mention, then not receiving funding might bar you from commencing a PhD if you do not fit into this position, because you then have to consider the 3 years, not receiving funding or not having enough money saved up for a PhD. You have to consider the course fees you will pay for the 3 years of the PhD and your living costs for the 3 years. And funding competition implicates necessarily, I think it implicates 3 crucial questions. The jurisdiction you're applying to, the research topic, which I've spoken at length about already, and the university. I might not want to take them in turn, but simply, I'd just like to say that with the jurisdiction, you have to consider and understand that some jurisdictions naturally have a more favorable attitude and culture to funding doctoral research than other jurisdictions. I know that North America and Asia have a better attitude to funding research than most European and in particular British institutions. And I actually nearly lost my mind when a friend of mine told me that their PhD was not only fully funded, a PhD in a US university was not only fully funded by the university, but she was also being paid as if she was employed to complete the research. And it startled me, but then it also made me to realize that this is a question you potentially would have had to consider even before making your applications. I believe that UK schools in particular are more exploitative for this because you could find that a sizable proportion of the research students in big universities like Oxford and Cambridge are not fully funded, or they're not even funded at all. And some of them are working, but they're mostly from developing countries. And when you understand that the research is what actually contributes to the university's ranking, all those rankings you see, the Times and all the other rankings, it's the quality of research that mainly is ranking, then you could actually explain that as an exploitative relationship because it is the research that is contributing to the university's ranking, and there honestly isn't any reason for the university to not fund the application. So this is a dead horse this at this stage, but the funding is a very important question that you have to consider. And then the topic, I've already talked about the topic. It's something that this actually motivated me to. Yes, I'm almost concluding stage. Thank you. But this motivated me to sort of change my topic almost 3 months after already having commenced my PhD, because I found that whenever I mentioned my topic to people that were not lawyers, they couldn't understand quite clearly what international arbitration was all about, or international commercial arbitration. And so I changed it to a topic that now is so much interesting that when I mention it to principal in my college, or maybe I'm attending a dinner out at the university and I mention it, and even when I put in the paper for publication, a very unique topic that speaks to physics and not just law. And so that is why I believe the topic is very important. And the last thing is the university itself. I've already foreshadowed this already. But the university is one that has to be willing in the university's ideology, the foundational beliefs of the university must accommodate funding a PhD like atomized. But now I will leave it at this. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. There's more to say about funding besides, because a PhD project is different from a master's, so that you can engage in negotiations with the university to fund your PhD research, which I don't think is very usual when we're talking about master's programs. But I will park it right there, and I can expect that Dr. Kaya Eli will do better justice to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Odinaka. Again, that was excellent, and I know you were racing against time. So I appreciate that you were able to do all of that in 15 minutes, or just slightly over. I will now introduce Adedakpo Adeni, and just so to foreshadow like what is to come. I know that we some of the sessions have bled over a little bit, so we are now, behind schedule. But the plan was to take like a 5 minute break. It might, like people can let us know if it makes sense to take the break just after this one. So we'll probably just reduce that to a minute or two so people can take toilet breaks and take water, etc. And then after the break, we'll be having Faith Oyewale, who, like I said earlier, most people just focus on the UK and the US, because all the role models we have gone either to the UK or the US. So a lot of people just concentrate on those jurisdictions. But Faith will be speaking about opportunities beyond the UK and the US, including Switzerland and some of the ways to excel as a graduate student in Europe and beyond. And then, like Odinaka said, we will be having Dr. Care Ellie, who will be speaking more specifically to writing a compelling PhD research proposal and landing a supervisor. And then after Kea, we will have Mujib Jimoh, who will speak to the A to Z of landing an Ivy League university scholarship and U.S. immigration concerns, especially in the current climate, in Trump's United States. And then finally, we will have Rashid Ijaudola speak on the A to Z of applying to Stanford and other US masters, and then priming yourself for postgraduate opportunities, which I know for most people, a master's or a PhD is really just a way of leveling up. So it will be important for you to stay for that final session. And then finally, all the speakers will rejoin the meeting so we can take Q&As. I know some of you have questions or you just need to clarify certain points. So please, I know, this is all very important. So I hope that people will stay for